So, in the first couple of videos in the Gospel of Matthew, we talked about the first few chapters, Jesus's ancestry and his birth, and then the Mary and Joseph's flight to Egypt. And then in the next video, we talked about the Sermon on the Mount. And so that got us through chapter 7. Now, in this video, I want to take some time to just kind of talk about the rest of the Gospel before what we call the events of Holy Week. So, all the way up until about chapter 25. So the kind of middle of Matthew is is in sandwiched in between all of this is Jesus calling his disciples. He's teaching. He performs miracles. Got these warnings of persecution, and he spends a lot of time. I'll say pushing back on the religious leaders. So they come and they try and trap him and ask him these questions they don't think there's a good answer to, and he gives them a good answer. And it's worth saying that, we spend a lot of time talking about Jesus's birth and Jesus's death, right? As we should. Those are two very high points. But all the Gospels really, but maybe we'll just look at Matthew as an example of this, is that most of the actual story is not spent talking about his birth and his death. It's that in between stuff. It's Jesus living, not just Jesus being born or Jesus dying. And maybe there is a kind of a parable there for us to say that we all get so we spend a lot of time, I guess, modern Christians, modern American Christians, we spend a lot of time worrying about well, who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, right? And perhaps we need to spend more time worrying about or thinking about the way that we live, the way that we live here and now. Because frankly, Jesus spends most of his time living, not most of his time dying or being born. An interesting little corollary to that, you might notice in our sanctuary we change the colors of they're called the paraments. So they're the cloth that's on the altar table and on the pulpit and the lectern, and they're different colors. And sometimes maybe you think we just change them because they look neat sometimes or they look nice. And while that may be true, that's actually not why we change them. We change them based on the season of the Christian year. Um, you see, we're purple or blue; those are kind of interchangeable. Purple or blue for Advent and Lent, and then yellow or gold or white for Christmas and the Easter season. All those are seasons, not just days. And then red for Holy Week and Pentecost. And those are kind of, big days, so to speak. Those are the times we talk about Jesus's birth and his death, right? But then you'll notice that big green section and that other smaller green section on the other side. We call those ordinary time. It doesn't have a particular uh, kind of high point like Jesus's resurrection or death or birth or something like that. It's just kind of all the other stuff in Jesus's life. And most of our year is spent in green, which I think is kind of this demonstration, like we see in Matthew, that most of Matthew is all about Jesus's life. Those things that are not talked about as much, frankly, as his birth and his death, his miracles, his teaching, his calling the disciples, things like that. All those are important in this Christian year calendar, the liturgical calendar, the colors kind of show us. So, getting into this, Jesus, one of the higher points of this in between section comes from Matthew 22. When it says this, one of them, a lawyer, one of the people challenging Jesus, a lawyer asked him a question to test him, Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? So you'll remember, as we've talked about, that Jesus is coming out of this Jewish tradition, right? And so as you're reading both Old Testament and New Testament together, but by the time you've read this, you're somewhere in Exodus, I think, and if you're keeping on the same schedule, and you started to read all these rules and regulations, and you start to think, oh my gosh, this is a lot. And the further you read, the more you think that this is like piling on. Some of these rules are a little stringent and strange. And so they come to him and they say, we have these 613 commandments. That's how many there are. Well, which one's the greatest, Jesus? Trying to test him, trying to trick him. And he said, this. He said, the greatest is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the greatest and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then you've heard that before. Then this last important thing, the next sentence. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So the law, remember the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, then the prophets, which we haven't quite read yet, but we're getting there. What he's saying is all of that stuff answers to these two commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. All of this other stuff has to do with the way that we love God and the way we love our neighbor. And so if we do something, Jesus is saying, if we do something that is by the book, a law, but it is not done in a loving way, then we miss the point, says Jesus. Remember, he didn't say I've come to abolish the law. He says I've come to fulfill it. He kind of infers that he's come to reinterpret it, to show it, not just to teach it, but to show it through his life. That this is what God is getting at with the law. And so then another part of this in Matthew is that we see Matthew has the most Old Testament quotes, and there's all these, this took place to fulfill, then quotes prophecy or quotes Torah. All throughout Matthew, this took place to fulfill. And I like it said this way, that it's as if Matthew is writing and then God is doing a voiceover. This took place to fulfill, and then God's voice comes in, and this is the law from the Old Testament. So a big question then, in Matthew particularly, Matthew is clearly writing to a Jewish audience, mostly a Jewish audience at least. And so you get a lot of those, this took place to fulfill. And so he's got these Old Testament quotes, and then it's really geared that way. And so the naturally arising question then is, if Matthew is the most Jewish and Jesus is the Messiah of the Jews, then what about everybody else, whom we'd call Gentiles? A Gentile is someone who's not Jewish. And look at this in chapter 10, verse 5. Jesus is talking to the disciples. He says, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And then he gives them this list of things to do: to proclaim the kingdom of God, to cure the sick, to raise the dead, to cleanse and cast out. And you might ask yourself, hang on a second, like me, I'm not Jewish, right? I am a Gentile. Did Jesus come for me or not? But then you get into this, when he says, don't go anywhere near the Gentiles, then Jesus goes and heals a Roman centurion servant. And he says this line, he says, "In no one in Israel, and no Jewish person, have I found such faith." Then there's these other little interactions with Gentiles throughout that we won't go into detail, but the Canaanite woman, the Gerasene demoniac, the Magi or wise men are Gentiles, and there's these positive interactions with them. And so it's been said that in Matthew, the mission of the disciples is to Israel, and the mission of Jesus is to the Gentiles and Israel. Maybe, maybe not. But post-resurrection, we get this to wrap it all up. Jesus said, "Go," this is like the second to last verse in the whole gospel. "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations." And so there may have been some confusion earlier in the gospel. I know we're jumping ahead. We're not on this video quite yet, but there may have been some confusion earlier in the gospel about who Jesus is for. But by the end, the resurrected Jesus makes no bones about it. "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations." Jesus is for everybody.